Premier Berejiklian, thank you for your time. Tell us about the devastation you've seen on the fire front over the past few weeks and what it means for your state going forward.
Andrew, the devastation is profound and is of a scale and magnitude which I don't think our state has seen before. And it's also important to recognise that every community you visit has been impacted in a different way. Every industry that's impacted, every resident who's lost a home. We have to treat these communities on a one-on-one basis, understand what they're going through and make sure the rebuilding process takes their views into consideration. And what I've seen has been devastating. Speaking to people who've lost everything, but I've also seen amazing resilience, amazing communities working together, people just standing up and demonstrating natural leadership and putting together volunteer-based evacuation centres or volunteer-based donation drop-off points, which are really sustaining some of our more remote and isolated communities. And what this means for the government is a big recovery process. It means rebuilding the infrastructure. It means restoring infrastructure to at least what it was before the bushfires, and in some cases needing to improve that, but also providing immediate support to businesses impacted. I mean, it's bad enough to lose a home, and I can't imagine the trauma that people are experiencing in losing a home, but also to lose your job, lose your livelihood. We have a lot to do in New South Wales, and our government, my government, is committed to getting on with the task. We have a sense of urgency about us. Because we know that once, for some communities the shock is still being absorbed, and you can see it as you visit different places. Different communities are reacting in their own way as they know best on the ground. And of course we need to be there at every step of the way, but also acknowledge the stage at which communities are at in the rebuilding process.
Can we talk about hazard reduction? Because obviously this is an issue that's come up. Your Environment Minister's said there needs to be more. Scott Morrison's said, the Prime Minister's just said then he needs to be confident going forward that we have the resilience in place. Is it time to lift the National Parks target of 135,000 hectares a year? And will you concede, and everything's wise in hindsight I suppose, that the government could have done more on this front?
Well, Andrew, New South Wales is always guided by the experts. It's not for politicians to decide how we manage hazard reduction or backburning operations. I feel extremely confident in the RFS in New South Wales who've led the charge. And if you ask Commissioner Fitzsimmons, he said proactively publicly this week that weather conditions are pretty much a huge determinant of hazard reduction operations as well. You can set those targets, but as the summers get longer, as the wind conditions get more ferocious, your window to conduct some of those activities is reducing. So we have met the targets. We've done more than what's happened in the past. That's not to say we can't do more. But I'm of the strong view that people in elected jobs like myself need to take the advice of our experts. And what heartens me in New South Wales is that the RFS has been working closely with the Forestry Corporation, with the National Parks and Wildlife Service to oversee these operations. And if they determine, after we do a review of these bushfires, if they determine we need to up the ante, of course we will. If they determine we need to change laws in relation to land clearing, well, certainly we'll consider those. At the end of the day, we must listen to the experts. We must listen to those who are in charge of preventing fires, reducing the fire hazard. And I'm grateful, notwithstanding the public criticism we copped a couple of months ago, a lot of hazard reduction activity in places like the Blue Mountains and in other parts of the state were met with public outcry. But I'm glad they pursued, because many homes and many lives were saved because that activity was undertaken. And if we need to do more, of course we will. We'll never shirk our responsibilities. When it comes to life and death and protecting property, that's always got to be a government's priority. But I do believe we need to listen to the experts and not make things up as we go along as elected representatives, and that's very important.
Sure, and I know what you're referring to with the controversy over the smoke with the backburning at that time. Have you sought an explanation from anyone as to why in 2016-17 and 2017-18 the hazard reduction, the burns were under target? Because they were certainly over target last year, but in those 2 years they were sort of more 70%. Have you had an explanation as to that?
Well, in some years it's over target, in some years it's under target, but on average we've pretty much met the targets. And again, they're matters for the experts. They depend on weather conditions, they depend on the opportunities you have when you have a particularly long season, long summer season, or hotter, drier temperatures and more excessive wind or rain conditions that hampers your efforts. And of course, their advice that we'll continue to take from the experts. But I can't stress enough how important it is for us to look at the science, to look at the experts and really take decisions moving forward. And I think given the tragedy, the catastrophe that's fallen at the feet of New South Wales and also Victoria, I think the community is really, ready and willing to accept the advice of experts moving forward and support the government in whatever we need to do to protect life and property. And I do feel that is that groundswell of support for government to do more if we have to. But having said that, the focus very much in these communities that have been hardest hit, hardest impacted, is still on recovery. It's about how do we get long-term accommodation? How do we get our businesses up and going? How do I not have to sack everybody in my business? How can I keep jobs in town going? I mean, the focus very much in those communities directly impacted is really how do we pick ourselves up? How do we move forward? And that's where we have a role in supporting communities. And these debates will continue, they always have, and our government will continue to be at the forefront in terms of what we need to do as a response. But I really want to stress that at the forefront of many of these communities impacted, it's how do we keep the jobs going in our towns, how do we get people accommodated who've lost everything, and how do we rebuild? And we have to appreciate that whilst these debates continue and we need to participate in those debates, we also need to understand what the sentiment on the ground is. And that's why my colleagues and I are spending as much time as we can with affected people, affected businesses, to really get a sense of how traumatic this is and how widespread it is. And for those of us who live in bigger cities that haven't been impacted apart from the smoke haze, it's easy not to feel that level of connection, and that's why it's important for us to maintain that level of connection, because what I see and hear in an impacted community is very different from what I hear and see in other communities who are less impacted, and that's something we need to keep perspective on.
Sure. Now, look, there seems to be some resistance, like from Victoria and other states, towards the concept of a National Royal Commission. Have you actually put to Scott Morrison maybe the potential for a state and national, a joint Royal Commission? Is that something you've discussed with him? Is that something that you'd be in favour of?
Well, I've expressed both privately to the Prime Minister and also publicly that notwithstanding whatever decision is taken at a national level, I think it's important for each state to undertake their own review, and that's because obviously each state has its processes, has its governance arrangements, and it's important for us to take those learnings on and obviously take them into the future. And we've said that New South Wales, and I understand the Victorian Premier's already announced details of their state inquiry, but that doesn't prevent the federal or national government from doing their own, and I would be happy to participate in whatever the federal government saw fit. But I do feel states should still assess their own actions, their own activities.
Sorry
I'm open to what it...
Sorry to interrupt, but does that mean that you'd be open to having a joint state national Royal Commission as well as your own inquiry, if that could be facilitated?
Well, no, what I think is we'll have our own robust review, but if the federal government, if the national government came to us and said, this is what we want to do, we'd be very open to that.
OK, Premier. Now, I mean, are you concerned with that at the prospect of a potential blame game here? And I guess I'm talking...
No, I'm not.
Right.
Why not? At all. Because our emergency